Hi everyone, today I wanted to share with you how I do backyard birding on my Olympus OM-1. And backyard birding is not too dissimilar than any other type of birding, like when you go to a park and you're going to capture, say, some blue herons or osprey or maybe some hawks, bald eagles, etc. But I did find that backyard birding did require a little bit different technique and slightly different camera settings. So the biggest difference and challenge with backyard birding is the size of the birds. Typically they're only a couple of inches tall with a wingspan of maybe 6 to 10 inches like this wide, and they also move a lot faster. So it requires a slightly different technique and a little bit of anticipation of what the bird is going to do. So the first thing you want to do is set up the bird feeder in your backyard. And if you don't have a backyard, a lot of times you can go to a local park where they'll have bird feeders set up that you can go to. And I found that the birds at the park are actually pretty accustomed to people being around, so you can actually get a lot closer. As I mentioned before, because those birds are so small, you want to get as close as you can as possible and or use the longest lens that you have. So in my case, I'll be using the 75 to 300 and also my 300mm f4 with a teleconverter. So given the lenses I'll be using, I found that I could set up the bird feeder about 30 feet away and it would still allow me to get just enough pixels on the bird to get some nice detail, while at the same time leaving enough room in the frame in case I want to capture them in flight. I also set up some branches down on the ground just below the bird feeder so that the birds can land there and I can get some nice bird on a stick shots, but also as they fly up to the bird feeder, I can get some bird in flight shots. I also set up a small table next to the bird feeder and put a log on top and put my best bird seat on top of the log so that I can capture the birds as they land there and take off, but also to do my flash photography on the birds. Now that we have the feeding stations set up, you want to think about a couple of things. First is the timing. Generally speaking, birds are very active in the morning, say 1 or 2 hours after sunrise, and also in the evening about an hour or two before sunset. Now, the first time I set up my bird feeders, I didn't get any birds for about a week. It takes them a while to find a feeding station sometimes, so if you don't get any birds the first time you set it up, just be patient, fill it up to the top, leave it there, and I guarantee one day you're going to come home and that bird feeder is going to be empty. Now, the second thing you need to think about is where you're going to be sitting or standing in relationship to the feeding stations. Ideally, you want to have the sun behind your back, say over your left shoulder, over your right shoulder, so that the sun is shining directly onto the bird's face and body and wings. You definitely don't want to have the sun in front of you because then you'll get strong backlighting typically, and also it's going to be difficult to expose properly for the bird. Now, if it's a cloudy day, of course, you don't have to worry about that because you get nice soft lighting all the way around the bird. However, personally, I like to take pictures of birds when it's sunny out because I found that the shadows help bring out the feather details, and also the lighting brings out the colors of the bird a lot better. All right, now let's talk about the camera settings. And again, I'll be using my Olympus OM-1 Mark I, and I'm on firmware version 1.6. And I'll be pairing it with my Olympus 75 to 300 and 300mm f4 Pro. And depending which lens I use, the settings are going to be just slightly different. All right, we're going to be setting up two different groups of settings. The first group is going to be for birds in flight, and then the second group is going to be for birds on a stick. And then we're going to be saving these settings into C1 and C2 respectively. All right, so I've done a full reset on the camera, so we're going to be using all the default settings and only change the ones that we need to change. So the first thing we want to do is put the camera into shutter priority mode. Now let's go into the super control panel and go to the AF target mode, and we're going to change this to all. Click OK. Now let's go down to the AF mode. We're going to change this to continuous autofocus. And now let's go down to the shutter mode, and we're going to change this to Pro Capture SH2. And now let's go down to the memory settings, and I prefer to do this one where it's going to save the pictures to both cards equally. Just to have a backup, but that's kind of an optional thing. And then let's go over here to the image quality. And I like to shoot in RAW because I do edit all of the bird photos. And then let's go over here. Metering mode is fine. And SIS auto image stabilization is fine. And that's all we need to do here. All right, and then I'm going to rotate the rear dial and change my shutter speed to 1/4000th of a second. And I'll go into a little more detail about these individual settings after we're done setting up. So now let's go into the menu. And the first thing we want to do is go into shooting menu 1, page 1, which is where we're at. And we have image quality set to RAW. And I want to make sure that image review is turned off. All right, now let's go to page 3 and just double check. Our ISO auto is set to 12,800 and 200, and auto ISO is set to P, A, S, and M, and everything else is fine. Now let's go to page 4, and I like to change the EV step to be 1 EV. And now let's go to page 7, and I want to go into sequential shooting settings, and then click OK. All right, now let's go down to Pro Capture SH2, click over to the right, and for my 75 to 300 lens, I'm going to change this to 25 frames per second, which is, it's going to default to that if that lens were attached. And then I'm going to change my pre-shutter frames to 10. And then also I'm going to turn the frame count limiter off. Now if I'm using my Pro lens, 300mm f4 Pro, some of you have, other Pro lenses, you can change this to 50 frames per second. And I'm going to change my pre-shutter frames to 20. And that's really the only difference between the two lenses, and I'll talk about this more when we get into the demo. All right, now let's hit the menu button and go back. And we're going to go down here to silence settings. And I'm going to go down here and turn the speaker on. And what this will do is whenever the camera requires its initial autofocus, the camera's going to beep. All right, now let's go into the autofocus menu. I'm going to go down here on page 1 to release priority. And we're going to make sure both of these are turned off. And what this does is it tells the camera to not take a picture unless it thinks it has autofocus. All right, now let's go to page 2. And we're going to go down here to AF area pointer. I'm going to change this to on 2. And that will display little green blinkies for where it's autofocusing. And then we're going to go down here to subject detection. We're going to change that to bird. And then eye detection frame should be on by default, but if it's not, turn that on. All right, let's go to page 3. And CAF sensitivity, we're going to set that to high or +2. Center priority, I'm just going to make sure all these are checked. And we're all set there. All right, now let's go to the operations menu. And then go down here to function lever settings. And I'm going to just double check to make sure that's on mode 2. So we're switching AF modes and targets. And then go down here to function lever, power lever, and make sure that's also set to FN or function. All right, now let's go to the back of the camera and change our lever to position 2. And then go in the super control panel, go to our target mode. We're going to change this to small and center it and go back out. Let's go into the super control panel, and for some reason this changed to manual focus, but we want to make sure that this is on continuous autofocus. And then put this back into position 1. Okay, and that's it. So let's go over to back to menu 1 and click on custom mode and click on C1. And we're going to assign C1 all of the settings we just made. So we're going to click on set and go back out. And now you can see C1 is set. All right, now we've saved all our bird and flight settings to C1. I'm going to save our bird on a stick settings to C2. And all I'm going to do is reduce the shutter speed to 1/1000th. And then I'm going to go into the super control panel and change Pro Capture SH2 to silent single shutter. Okay, now let's go to the back of the camera. We have the lever in position 1. Let's go into the super control panel, go back to our targeting mode, and we're going to make that single, make sure it's centered, click OK. We're going to flip to position 2 and do the same thing. Go in the super control panel and make this a single, or I'm sorry, small point, click OK. And the camera is now in manual focus mode, but that's okay. We'll leave it on that for lever position 2. Now let's go back into the menu. Page 1, custom mode. Go to C2, click OK. Click on assign. Click OK on set. And go back out. And now you can see we have C1 set up and C2. So C1 is our bird in flight. C2 is our bird on a stick. Okay, let's go ahead and put the camera into C1, which is our bird in flight mode, and C2, if you recall, is our bird on a stick. So when I'm in the field, I can very quickly, just using my thumb, switch between bird in flight and bird on a stick. So over the past week, I've been fine-tuning and practicing with these settings, and I recorded a little footage along the way. I didn't do a lot of that because it's really hard to capture the birds and take pictures while recording at the same time. But I'm going to show you some of that footage to give you an idea of how to frame the birds and capture them in flight. And you may notice that some of the settings don't exactly match what we just did here in the video, but rest assured the settings that I gave you are the final settings or best settings that I found for capturing backyard birds. All right, so here's a typical scene of a red-winged blackbird on a stick, and this is just above the bird feeder. And if I want to capture this bird in flight, so I need to anticipate what direction he's going to fly into. And immediately I'm thinking, yeah, he's got to fly in a downward direction if he wants to go to the bird feeder. And he's facing to the left, so I'm assuming he's going to go to the left and down. So I want to frame this bird in the top right corner. So first I make sure I can acquire focus. So I've acquired autofocus onto the bird, and now I'm moving the bird into the top right frame, or corner of the frame. And now the bird has jumped down and started flying bottom left, just like I anticipated. However, he quickly dipped and flew back up into the tree, which I did not anticipate. But I was able to pick him up again very quickly here. And now I'm not sure exactly what he's going to do. He's still looking down at the bird feeder, so I'm thinking maybe he's going to fly down and to the right, but I'm not exactly sure at this point because he didn't do what I thought last time. So let's move on, and you can see now the bird is actually flew again. He came down, changed his mind, and went back up into the tree. But I'm keeping my eye on him. So now we're over here, and I'm trying to guess, what is this bird going to do next? Is he going to fly off and leave the area, maybe go to another feeder somewhere else, my neighbors, for example? Or is he going to stay here and try and get some more food from my feeder? So I'm going to try and frame this bird again, probably in the top right corner. But he didn't do any of that. He just flew straight down before I could make up my mind. All right, so here's a northern cardinal, and here I'm obviously anticipating the bird is going to fly down and maybe a little bit to the right, so I have him framed in the top, and let's see what he does. He's looking down, and then he should fly to the bottom right, because that's where the bird feeder is. But as he was going down, if we back up, you'll notice that he didn't open his wings. So I didn't capture anything there, but when I got down to the bottom here, I noticed the sparrow sitting on one of the branches that I set up underneath the bird feeder. So I'm anticipating he's going to fly in an upward direction. So let's see what happens here. And he did it so quickly, I didn't even have a chance to, frame the bird properly. But I ended up actually getting one frame of this bird. If we back up, I think this one is pretty good right here. All right, now let's switch over to bird on a stick, and this is where you use the small focus point, and you can lower your shutter speed down to say 1/1000th of a second or lower if you want. I had pretty good lights, so I try to keep my shutter speed up as fast as possible. And I'm going to go over here, and it's ideal to have the center focus point or small focus point for these kind of shots, because sometimes the autofocus will pick up on the branch, in front of or behind the bird and not actually focus on the bird. So that's why for bird on a stick shots, it's better to use the small autofocus target point. And then here's another example. This bird is perched on the branches below the bird feeder. And I thought the lighting and stuff was really nice on this bird, so I captured a couple of snaps of this bird. All right, so I'm going to provide a link down below to this cheat sheet so you can download it. It's basically all of the settings and the things we talked about today in the video. But I wanted to go over some fine print here. So first of all, in the video I recommended 1/4000th of a second. And even at that shutter speed, you're still going to see some slight motion blur in the wings, which, you know, is a creative choice. Maybe you want that, maybe you don't. If you don't want that, you really need to be at 1/8,000th of a second to freeze the wings. Another setting I want to kind of elaborate on is the image stabilization. Now, there's an argument to be made that when you're at 1/4000th, 1/8000th of a second, you don't need image stabilization. And in fact, that it could actually blur the image a little bit because it can't keep up with the shutter speed or for whatever reason. A lot of people recommend turning image stabilization off when you're at these kinds of shutter speeds because you don't really need it. And I can tell you that I've shot both ways with image stabilization off and on, and I didn't see any difference in the sharpness. It seemed perfectly fine either way. But the reason I recommend you leave it on is because when you're trying to frame the bird on the stick before it takes off, it's easier to do when it's not jumpy, right? The image stabilization kind of locks the frame nice and steady. And then going further down here, this one here, the SH2 sequential shooting settings. So if you're using like the 75 to 300, you're going to be maxed out at 25 frames per second. I think the OM-1 Mark II can go below 25 frames per second, but this is a good speed for non-pro lenses. And I recommended, if you're using a non-pro lens, to do 10 pre-shutter frames. And what I'm trying to do here is minimize the total number of frames that you capture when you're using pro capture, because I've walked, you know, even with these conservative settings, I've come back from an hour of shooting with like 2,000 images. So there'll be like 10 frames of the bird taking off from the branch, and then there'll be like 20 or 30 frames of the bird, you know, out of the, you know, gone already, and I just have pictures of the branches and sticks around it. So, you know, I recommend setting this to 10 when you're at 25 FPS. More than that is not really necessary, but you need to experiment and see what works best for you. However, if you're shooting with a pro lens like the 300mm f4 Pro or the 150 to, you know, 400, whatever, they can do 50 frames per second. And you really want to have your pre-shutter frame set to 20 or more. But what I found is that even though I'm half pressing the shutter button to buffer the frames, by the time I push it fully, the bird is already taken off of the branch when I had it set to 10 frames per second and using a pro lens. So that's how quickly these birds move. They are in and out of the frame in fractions of a second. So if you're shooting at 50 frames per second, you really need to have at least 20 pre-shutter frames for pro capture. Now the frame count limiter, in the video I recommended turning it off, but I would suggest you try setting it to double whatever your pre-shutter frames are. Again, just trying to minimize the number of frames that you take home and have to call through, and or fill up your memory card before you're done, right? I've done that. So I recommend it off in the video, which is fine if you're really good at letting go of the shutter after the bird is out of the frame. Another setting that some people like to change is the sound. So when you have pressed the shutter button, I have sound allow, it's going to beep whenever it acquires focus. And I like to hear that myself. Some people don't like that, but I like to hear it because as you can see in the video, it's freezing cold right now. And my fingers get numb while I'm sitting there waiting for the bird to do something. And I can't even feel the shutter button, especially when I'm wearing gloves. I can't feel if my finger's on the shutter button. So when I half press, you know, I like to hear that beep to know that my finger is actually on the shutter button. Because there's been times where I've mashed the shutter button hard as I can and I didn't capture anything because I wasn't actually pushing the shutter button. I was pushing somewhere else on the camera. And that's because I didn't hear anything. Another setting here is the CAF release priority. Some people like to leave this on. The logic being, well, first, let me remind you, the release shutter priority basically says don't take a picture unless you think you have focus when this is turned off. So it's not going to take pictures when it thinks it doesn't, you know, it's misfocus. Some people like to leave this on because it gives the potential to capture more frames than you would otherwise, right? Because the bird might actually be in focus, but the camera doesn't know it, and you miss that frame. So some people like to leave this on and capture more frames potentially of the bird in focus than if you had this turned off. Another one here is the AF area pointer on. I have that set to on too. Basically what that does is it shows the little square green boxes hovering around the bird or where it's focusing. I like to see that personally. If you don't like to see that, if it's distracting to you, you can turn it off or just set your AF area pointer to on 1. Another setting here is CAF Sensitivity +2. Basically what this does is if the bird is flying towards you, when you have this set to +2, it's going to try and refocus as quickly as it can. So you have more chances of the bird being in focus as it's flying towards you. You can set this to say -2. The situation you want to do that is like when the bird is flying horizontally across the frame, and let's say it goes behind the tree for a split second. If you have this set to +2, the camera might refocus on the tree until the bird comes out, and then it has to try to reacquire focus on the bird. If you have CAF sensitivity set to -2, it's going to stay on that bird, or more accurately, it's going to stay on that focal plane and not switch to the tree before the bird comes out on the other side. So I have a whole video on this. I'll try and put a link to it somewhere below, but for backyard birding, I recommend +2 every time. But for other situations, you may want to change that, and that's what that's for. The function lever settings, I didn't really talk about this much during the video either, but let's say you're in Pro Capture, you have all points set, you're on function lever position 1, and you're capturing birds, but then the bird is sitting there on a stick and the light is perfect, and you don't want to switch the mode dial to C2 and switch back to C1. It's faster to just flip the lever to lever position 2, take a quick picture. Even though you're in Pro Capture, you're going to capture 20 to 40 images, but at least you got the shot, and then you can quickly flip it back to lever position 1. So it's just a workflow issue that's a little bit faster when you're trying to capture a bird on a stick and you happen to be in Pro Capture mode. But you can see that for bird on a stick settings in C2, I have you change the focus point to small anyway, because that's what you're doing, is you're just taking a picture of the bird on a stick. You don't need to see the whole frame, or you don't need to try to focus on the whole frame. You're just trying to focus on the bird. So bird on a stick, in the sheet here, I put 1/250th of a second. That's a little slow, in my opinion. In the video, I showed you 1/1000th of a second. I recommend that. But if the light starts to drop, because you are doing this early morning or late evening, then you can try 1/250th of a second. But these birds are so small and they're always kind of twitching. You might get motion blur at 1/250th of a second. And then finally, I have the flash settings here, which I did not talk about in this video at all. Here's a couple of shots that I did using flash. I didn't want this video to be like 2 hours long, so I just didn't talk about this today. But if you guys are interested, I can talk about how I got these flash shots as well. There's that. But let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do a video on how I do flash photography for the birding. So if you've made it this far and you liked the video, consider buying me a coffee or making a donation in the links below, because they are greatly appreciated and they help support the work that I do here to help the photography community. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.